the New Indian, we have Dr. Subhash Kak, an Indian American computer scientist, a philosopher, a historian, and a mathematician. In other words, a polymath. He's also a recipient of India's fourth highest civilian award, that is Padma Shri, for his contributions to maths, philosophy, computer science, and astronomy of ancient India. Welcome to the virtual episode of Reason, Dr. Kak. I'm going to begin this conversation with you, Dr. Kak, on a very simple question. I think you've been asked this question several times, but I'm going to repeat it for the sake of our audience. You've been working on computers a lot. So my question is, what is consciousness? And is it possible for scientists to create and manufacture computers with consciousness?
This topic has become extremely important now because we live in the age of AI, and there are many people who believe that computers will eventually become consciousness. So then, in order to see what needs to be done for this to happen, we have to know what consciousness is. Now, consciousness is not a thing. It is a certain property associated with our experience. And therefore, from the scientific perspective, to deal with it is not as easy as one imagines. Nevertheless, it is now center stage in science and generally accepted that it is the frontier of all of science.
Dr. Kak, if consciousness is connected to all the aspects of life, is it possible that it is connected with genetics as well? Can you explain it?
Well, first, computers are not conscious machines, while the brain machine is conscious. Now, the brain machine, of course, is created by our genes, and so are we nothing but an expression of how the genes create the whole architecture of the body and the brain. Well, it so turns out that it's not just the genes by themselves, just the DNA. It's how the genes express themselves, and that depends on a variety of things, on the environment, as also what goes on in the mind. So there is a connection between mind and body, and it is of relevance to so many different fields, including modern medicine, and especially because modern medicine is facing what is called the crisis of reproducibility. A lot of the research cannot be reproduced, and that's because the research just does not normally take into account the role that the mind plays in the wellness of the individual.
Does language have any role in shaping the neurology of humans? Dr. Kak, is it also possible that languages could be creating different cultures and different consciousnesses?
Animals are also conscious, but animals lack rich language like humans have. And our mind rehearses a lot of stuff using language. And because of this, our consciousness is influenced by the language that we use. And therefore, one could say that languages or cultures have an influence on consciousness. For example, the Chinese language is a kind of a sign. It's not a language which converts, or it's not a script which converts directly into sound, and that's why you can have hundreds of languages in China, and it does have many different languages, but they use the same signs, and that offers a certain uniformity to the culture. However, This also makes the Chinese look at reality in a way which is different from those cultures where languages are inflected, like Indian languages. And so there is a relationship, and this is well recognized in psycholinguistics, although it's a contested field, and there is a whole spectrum of opinions on how exactly this thing functions.
Dr. Kak, can we say that there is Sanskrit or Kashmiri or Bengali or Tamil, or for that matter, a broader Indian consciousness? Would it be correct to say that there's something called Indian consciousness?
I would say yes, and that's because the Indian subcontinent has had tremendous interaction within, across the languages spoken by the people and the literary language or the language of philosophy, namely Sanskrit. And we have huge amounts of texts, more than in any other cultural area. And it there is a certain commonality to all of this, and this commonality can be traced to the belief, for example, in that we are more than just bodies. I think this is what uh, makes the Indian cultural area unique and different from other cultural areas. In other cultural areas, like that of Europe or the Arabian civilizational area, you have bodies and you also have soul, but the soul is in the religious understanding, the soul sort of resides in the body, and body itself is to be viewed completely as something which is controlled by this inner agent. In modern science, on the other hand, you are primarily just the body, because the mind is something that emerges on the brain, and this is different from the Indian uh, consciousness area, where the Ishvara and the body, the Ishvara is the enjoyer within, or let's put it somewhat differently in modern terms. You have the body, you have the mind, and you have consciousness. The mind, in contrast to the other civilizational areas, is only an instrument. In other civilizational areas, mind is an agent, for example, in the Western tradition. So here, mind is only an instrument, because the true agent is consciousness itself, as it gets reflected in the mind. So what it does, and this is something that's been embraced in all corners of India, and it's also a part of the Buddhist experience, and therefore this was the dominant view to relating with the world in most of Asia and in Central Asia as well, because we do know that Sanskrit influenced Central Asia greatly. In fact, also the Slavic world. In fact, now it's been discovered, because the Slavs converted to Christianity rather late, after 1000 AD or so, and it was a very slow and protracted contest. But now we know that the chief divinity of the Slavs was a four-faced divinity, and seems to have been borrowed from the idea of Shiva, for example. Shiva is supposed to have five faces, but fifth is facing upwards. And these four faces of this divinity that the Slavs call Shvetovid. Shvetovid has a beautiful Sanskrit etymology of vid meaning knower. Shveta is white, or it can also mean light, the knower of light. And as we know, Shiva as consciousness is also called light, or prakasha. So the four faces of Shvetovid are, in the north is Svaroga, which is Svarga, On the west is Parjanya or Perkunis. In the south is Lada, which in Sanskrit means the earth. Moksha. Well, the north is Moksha and the east is Swarga. So you find that persistence of Sanskrit, and this is something that's not been researched very broadly, although you can read up on it quite easily. In fact, I presented a paper on Shvetovid in a conference of historians in Belarus just a few months ago, and you can read it up on the internet.
Dr. Kak, what role has Kashmiri language, Kashmiri Shaivism, Sanskrit language played in shaping up the Indian consciousness? Can we even ask this question?
Sanskrit, as we have already mentioned, is quite central to all of the Indian experience, all of the Indian high experience related to the deepest questions in all across all regions of India. And in fact, as Greater India expanded into Southeast Asia, and it was carried there to a great extent by people from the south, maybe from the Tamil country and from Odisha and from Telugu and Karnataka or Kannada country. The vehicle was still Sanskrit. So it didn't really matter which region you came from. And you find that the ancient Javanese language, for example, or the Balinese language have a huge element of Sanskrit vocabulary. And from there it went up to Champa, which is Vietnam, and Thailand, and Philippines, and all the way to Japan and Korea. There was also a movement from Kashmir and Central Asia, again to China, Korea, and Japan. And according to the University of Pennsylvania sinologist, well-known scholar Victor Meyer, this was to play a very fundamental role in the shaping of Chinese culture and language. And it's been estimated that about 35,000 words of the Chinese language are derived from Sanskrit. This is according to Victor Meyer. And of course, for about 1,000 years, all the Sanskrit documents, which had all aspects of philosophy and sciences, were translated into Chinese and other Asian languages. And there was this whole movement, and much of this was done by Kashmiri scholars, such as Kumarajiv, for example, and others who followed him. And since you mentioned Kashmir Shaivism, people don't quite realize that even Mahayana Buddhism worships Shiva, and one of the most popular worship which is done in Sanskrit even now in China, Japan, and all those countries is called Nilakanta Dharani. And Nilakanta, as we know, is the name for Shiva, the blue-throated one. And this, in fact, is a worship by Avalokiteshvara, who is one perfected bodhisattva. And in fact, the feminine form of Avalokiteshvara is represented in images all across East Asia. So in this worship, in Sanskrit, even now, Avalokiteshvara himself is worshipping Shiva as Nilakanta, as the most compassionate being, because Shiva swallows the halahal poison which emerges at Samudra Manthan and protects the whole universe, because if the poison had spilled on the universe would have been destroyed. Now, of course, we're not to take all of this as literal truth. These are symbolic expressions, but we see tremendous influence on all of Asia, and the fact that Shiva is still worshipped, and Vishnu as well, by the Buddhists is not broadly known. In fact, this division between Buddhism and and Sanatan Dharma is to a great extent a creation of modern academic Buddhologists or scholars who were sort of motivated by seeing these two as two different currents. But as the great scholar of Indian culture, art, and civilization, Ananda Kumaraswamy, in his book Hinduism and Buddhism, said, the deeper you go into the study of these, you realize that there is really no difference. So all of this does belong to what is recognized as Indian consciousness.
Now, let me ask you a different question altogether, because it seems that we are getting into areas of debate where there's the danger of being labeled as pseudoscience. In fact, India has been accused of forgetting the distinction between science and pseudoscience, myth and reality, myth and science. Is there a danger of intertwining science and mythology here?
Before religions that emerged with Christianity and subsequent to that, the religion as understood was a relationship with nature and with perceived reality. For example, the old Greek religion, I'm talking here of the West, or the Roman religion, or Slavic religion, or even the ancient Arabic religion, which was not very different. And in fact, you have contemporary scholars speaking of how these images represented fundamental truths. So religion, from the Latin religio, what binds, where it's a kind of a social phenomenon, is something which is true perhaps of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is not true to the same extent of Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma, because Sanatan Dharma is really is not about confession of a certain belief. It's about knowledge, whose understanding changes as we grow up, or as our relationship with reality deepens. So it's more about what we do than what we believe in, because after all, what we believe in is something is always a mystery, because there's no simplicity of this, because reality in itself is enigmatic, is paradoxical, and this is something that is very well recognized in the entire Vedic tradition. For example, the famous Ishavasya Upanishad speaks about these poles, vidya and avidya, materiality and spirit, and life is a dance, like Shiva's dance, between these two poles, between living and death, for example, between transition, transformation, and life. So I think the recognition that the Western scientific understanding of reality was limited became very clear with quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, as we know, is the deepest theory that we have in science, and it's at the basis of all the great stuff that science and technology has done in the last 100 years. You cannot have ICs and computers and modern communication without knowledge of quantum mechanics. Now, people don't quite know that the very founder of quantum mechanics, or one of the two founders of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, was a Vedantin. He was Austrian, but he was a Vedantin. And in his own autobiography, he credits inspiration that he obtained from Upanishadic thought in arriving at the central notion of quantum mechanics. So, to answer your question, this line between science and religion is a line between knowledge and sociology of power, and that is a separate issue altogether. I think it's not of relevance to the Indian civilizational area, because in the Indian civilizational area, uh, there could be many different schools that one would be connected with, or choose one amongst these for one's life. But the important thing was knowledge. India has always been a knowledge centric civilization. And as the West, the rest of the world also uh, moves towards this objective, you will see that the West will increasingly adopt all of this. And as we see this, for example, in the popularity of yoga, yoga is sweeping the entire globe. You go to the smallest corners in towns and villages in Europe or South America or Russia or China, certainly the big cities, you will find yoga studios, you'll find people doing yoga. Even in Saudi Arabia, women and others are doing yoga in a big way. And I was at this big conference a few years ago where there was also a lady from Iran. Iranian women are also doing yoga. Now, what is yoga? Yoga is the technology of self-knowledge. Yoga is Hinduism in practice. If you look at the two great texts of yoga are the Bhagavad Gita, which is the central text of Hinduism. In fact, Bhagavad Gita speaks of yoga of different kinds. You do not only have Hatha Yoga, which is physical asanas, because that is only preparation of the body. All of that you do, Jnana Yoga or Raja Yoga or Karma Yoga, Laya Yoga, there are various different kinds of yoga you can do which bring you to consciousness within you, and this consciousness is what is called Shiva in Kashmir Shaivism. Let me also say that Kashmir Shaivism is one expression of Vedanta. The very heart of Vedas is what Vedanta is, or the end of Vedas, or the essence of Vedas. So you have Shankara's Vedanta, which speaks of how you could look at Jagat as mithya, or as illusion, and reality being Brahman, which is consciousness. But now Kashmir Shaivism says that this universe, physical reality, is also a embodiment of consciousness. So it's Shiva embodied, and therefore there is a slight difference of focus, because you can also say that that idea of illusion is only to emphasize the transitory nature of physical reality, which is certainly true. And so these are two different forms of Vedanta, and there are a few others, where in Kashmir Shaivism we also embrace reality as it is, our bodiness, so to speak, as it is, while in the southern tradition of Shankara, there is more emphasis of or focus on the journeying itself, on journey towards knowledge.
So, my question is it possible to really draw neat lines between science and philosophy? Because a lot of what you really say is both philosophy and science.
So we cannot, in the Indian tradition of consciousness, we do not make a distinction between science and philosophy. Philosophy is just the interpretive mechanism that we have to understand science, and as is true of modern science as well. You have quantum mechanics, and then you have interpretations of quantum mechanics, which are philosophical, and there can be a lot of debate amongst these interpretations. Likewise, you have the various darshanas within the Vedic thought, And these darshanas look at different aspects of reality through logic or through yoga or through tattvas, which is Sankhya, or through traditional ritual or traditional categories, and Vedanta itself. And you can have others, and certainly Kashmir Shaivism, with its focus on consciousness, is one of those.
Why should younger generations study ancient texts or Indian scriptures? What exactly can they gain from it when we hardly have any jobs related to ancient texts? Why is it necessary?
Indian knowledge tradition is of extraordinary richness. Um, Indian texts are more than, and I'm talking of Sanskrit texts alone, are more than the texts available in all the other world languages combined, and many of them have not been translated. India is not just about religion and bhakti. India is about sciences, all kinds of sciences, um, from uh, from logic to physics to medicine, Ayurveda, to animal things, to geology, or what have you, and certainly other sciences where architecture, art, and all that comes in. So, what happened very unfortunately with the coming of the British sort of shut down Indian traditional system of education, which were pathshalas and other schools that existed. And so Indians slowly over the years, over the generations, became separated and alienated or strangers to their own tradition. And this is of extraordinary richness, and a large focus or part of it is consciousness, which is the frontier of modern science also. And in order to make further advances, I believe Indian insights would still be useful, not just for those who are interested in philosophy or their personal spiritual growth, but also to scientists as well. In fact, my own research has benefited a lot because I do work in all of these fields. I do work on consciousness and quantum mechanics and all that, and it has benefited from my understanding of the Indian tradition on this.
I'm going to repeat this question because I think any young person watching this video would ask, what does it matter what history was, what India was 5,000 years ago, or what our scriptures said 5,000 years ago? And they might turn around and ask that, how is it relevant to them today? Why should they be interested in this to begin with?
Uh, we are in the AI age, and beyond AI comes consciousness. I think for us to be ready to deal with the complexities that the AI age is going to bring to all of us, because these complexities would be related to the fact that that many jobs for which routine work is required will be done by machines in the future. So new kinds of jobs or professions or disciplines will have to be created, and they will be created by those who are in touch with the subtleties of the working of consciousness. So I think India will be ahead if we get connected to our own tradition, and it's ultimately a universal tradition. It doesn't distinguish between person and person, male and female, or whatever gender preference you might have, or which region of the world you come from, and what your personal aesthetics is, or what your personal belief is. It is a tradition of expansion of the mind, a tradition of relating oneself to the deepest mystery, which asks questions as to who we are. Just to step back and see how important all this is, note that the US, which is the richest nation that has ever been, and not only because of its recent history, but also because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. America sucks up the wealth of a lot of the other lands also. So in this rich country where people live in these beautiful houses, 100,000 people last year died of opioid or drug overdose. Why are people dying of drug overdose? Because people are extremely unhappy. They're extremely unhappy because even if you're living in the best houses, you're a good looking person, you're a success, but you're still unhappy that you're nothing but the body, because that's what the mainstream media and the school system, that's the paradigm within which the Western tradition operates. And in my view, as a scientist and as a scholar of history and the Indian tradition, I would say that that paradigm is limited and wrong, and it's being slowly replaced by one where consciousness is central to our understanding of reality. Because just imagine, we don't go to all these planets and stars and galaxies which lie beyond our own solar system. All of this experience exists in our consciousness. Consciousness is central reality, and everything else. And of course, that doesn't mean that there's nothing but consciousness. There's also this physical reality. There is these two, body and consciousness, which in the Vedic tradition was called Vidya and Avidya. Vidya is consciousness, Avidya is materiality. And the Vedas recognized that there are two kinds of knowledge. One is Apara and Paravidya. Apara is the language, is the knowledge associated with things that go through transitions, which is materiality, for which language is an important component for understanding, which are the normal subjects that we study in school and college. And Paravidya is the knowledge of consciousness. And in fact, what the Vedas say is that you must do Aparavidya to sharpen your mind so that you can then do Paravidya. And Paravidya would set you free. And I think it's totally wonderful in so many different ways. And I do wish and hope that more people, and doesn't really matter what your background is, everybody is equal. Then each individual is the same Purush. Purush is embodiment of consciousness within each individual. In fact, in Kashmir Shaivism, you have this great slogan, Shivoham, Aham Shiva, I am Shiva. Every human being is fundamentally, if they were to throw off the scales of ignorance, created out of habit and conditioning and forgetting, so to speak, forgetting our true self, one would find immeasurable abilities and creativity within oneself. And that's true of every individual.
That has been absolutely one of the most fascinating conversations I have ever had on philosophy and science and the future of philosophy and science together. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Kak.
Thank you, Aarti ji. It was wonderful chatting with you.
We will come back with another episode of Reason very soon. Thank you.